What is up, harvesters? Welcome back to Hobby Harvest. My name is Ken. So today I want to talk to you guys about the number one attraction when we're doing this habitat improvement stuff, and that of course is food plots. Now, there's snow on the ground. Why am I talking about food plots this time of year? Well, we're in that time of year right now where we really need to start planning on what we're going to be doing next year. And the number one thing you need to be concerned about is your food plots. So you may already have some food plots in. You may be thinking about putting more food plots in. You may be brand new to all of this and you're considering putting your first food plot in. By all means, do it and go all in on it, because food plots are the number one habitat improvement attraction in the deer woods. So the deer will relate all of their daily movement around that food source. So all of the other habitat improvements come secondary to food plots. Once we have food plots in, then we can start getting worried about bedding and making man-made deer trails that force movement through certain parts of the property, putting in things like mock scrapes, watering holes, screening, working about our ingress and our egress from our stand locations. All of that is secondary to food plots. So we need to start thinking about where we want to put these food plots. And then I'm going to get into all the specifics of food plots in this video, but watch till the end, because just in case I forget something in here, leave a comment down in the comments so that we can try to help everybody kind of cover all the bases in this habitat improvement world. So let's get started. I guess why put in food plots? I already covered that. You will get the deer to change their entire daily movement based on that food source, as long as it's the number one food source in the area. So I'm going to talk about how we establish and how we create that number one food source in this video. But what we need to think about when we're putting in our food sources is how much food. Well, a good starting point is 2 acres per 40 acres. Now that's going to change depending on how much ag you have in the area, if your neighbors are planting food plots, things of that nature. So you will just need to adjust off of that, but that's a good, just like one size fits all starting area for you to consider. But when I say that, I do not mean put in a 2-acre food plot on a 40-acre parcel. I like to compartmentalize everything on my properties, my bedding areas, my food sources, everything. So when I say put in 2 acres of food on a 40-acre square, I'm more leaning towards putting in like 4 half-acre food plots. And then I want to talk about the shape of those real quick too. I do not like putting in like a square or a circle or an oval food plot. Most of my food plots are in the shape of like a boomerang, so that even if it is a half acre, you essentially have like 2 quarter-acre pieces that are sort of separated by each other, because you either use topography to split them up, you put your brush pile when you're cutting trees down out of those food plots, if that's something you needed to do to establish them, or you try to get something like brush, like red osier dogwood or tag alder or whatever, depending on where you are in the world, to grow in there really thick so that the deer cannot see each other on opposite sides of that plot. It helps you compartmentalize more deer even on that specific plot, even though you have all of these plots throughout your land. So that's a good thing to consider. And when you're considering putting in your food plots, have that greater habitat improvement goal in mind, so that you can like eventually connect all of these attractions and throw in bedding area, throw in those man-made travel corridors and whatever to like make all of this work together for you. But I know a lot of you guys are probably like me, like I have food plots in, but I'm considering putting in another new one next year anyway on my northwestern Wisconsin property, because up there food is king. That is in the snow belt up there, that big snow belt that covers from like Duluth, Minnesota to like Buffalo, New York, and everywhere in between along the Great Lakes there. The deer just get dumped on with snow. They just got like 1.5 foot of snow up there this week, and so it's looking like it's already going to be a harsh winter for them up there. So unfortunately, that means we are going to lose quite a bit of the younger deer during the winter this year if it continues. But by putting in those food sources and putting in more food sources, you're getting more deer through the winter. And that's what I want to talk about next. So I talked about the advantage of a food plot is you get those deer to change their daily movement, and that's great for hunting. But there are two other advantages to putting in food plots on your property. And the first is that you're going to control that daytime movement. So those deer are not going to be moving on your neighbor's property as often during the daylight hours. So you will have a lot more control over which deer get harvested in your area. So even if your neighbor is a brown it's down hunter, you can hold a lot more of those doe family groups and those bucks on your property so that your neighbor's not even seeing them during the daylight, and they're not just wiping out your doe herd if they're a I gotta fill every tag I have kind of hunter. So that is a huge advantage to putting in food plots. You get to pick what it's harvested in your area, in your deer woods. And when you have that control, you can raise a larger deer herd, you can raise bigger bucks, you can do whatever you want, whatever your specific harvest goals are. Or maybe you do just like venison in the freezer, and you're going to have a much more consistent hunt, and you're going to have a much more consistent time like providing that venison for your freezer by doing this also. Now, the final thing though I want to talk about is something that happens after the hunting season. So like after we head into the winter now, having food sources is great for getting your deer herd through the winter in the northern part of the country, because those deer, if they get hit with a bad winter, you're going to lose probably half of your fawns and maybe even half of your yearlings as well. And that's just because their bodies aren't big enough to like survive the winter. So they die of exposure. Yeah, we can say they die of predation. I consider those two kind of one in the same, because if a deer loses so much body weight that it's dying of exposure, it's easier for a predator to pick it off. And yeah, I know that big mature bucks get taken down by predators as well, but far more likely that that fawn that doesn't have enough body weight on it to survive winter is going to get picked off first. And so that's why we lose a lot of them during a bad winter. But what we can do to help them through those bad winters is provide that food for them. So if we send them into winter with a full belly, there's a much greater chance that they will survive the winter, and we will have them around next season. So I'm going to jump ahead here to like what we plant, because one thing that you do want to plant if you're trying to do that is a cereal grain like winter rye. So winter rye is going to last well into the winter, and so they'll be able to feed on that until they eventually will browse it down to nothing, because there will just be so few food sources available because everything's covered in snow. And then you're at least sending them into the winter with a full belly. They still have to go, they have to find their browse, they have to find their acorns. Luckily this year we did have a bumper crop of acorns in the Northwoods, so those acorns will help to get them through the winter, because there were still so many acorns on the ground during gun deer season this year, because they were choosing to feed on those food plots instead, that left all those acorns now to get them through the winter too. So you're just providing more food than the natural habitat provides, and that's what's going to get them through the winter. Now, the advantage of planting something like a cereal grain, and especially winter rye, is it's going to pop up a couple weeks before spring green up. So you're actually taking them out of the winter a couple weeks earlier too. You're essentially making winter smaller for them. So again, you're getting more deer through the winter if you're in the northern part of the country. So, all right, I want to then get into it. We have our food plots established. We figure out where we want to put them. Now, I know that no-till is huge, and I've done a ton of no-till and it does work. I do though, once you've cleared your area, you've cleared the trees, the brush, whatever it was there that you're in the area that you want to create that food plot, do make sure you're getting sunlight down to that plot though when you are cutting. So don't just cut the immediate area, the surface area that the plot itself is going to be in. Face south. When you're in the northern hemisphere, put your arms up in like a 90-degree angle like this and look up into the sky and see which trees are blocking the sunlight from coming down to the plot, because though that is where the sun is going to travel, and that's how your plot is going to get sunlight. So I have a very small, just 1/16 of an acre food plot in the woods up north in northwestern Wisconsin, and I cut the trees so perfectly that it's almost like a sunbeam just travels right along the food plot and just bakes the food plot in sunlight. And that little plot then, even though it's completely surrounded by mature trees in the woods, is actually a very successful plot because it gets a ton of sunlight. But you're gonna need to make sure that your plots are getting sunlight. That is the number one thing. If they don't get sun, they're not gonna grow. and you need them to grow as thick and as lush as possible. So just because you have, say, a half-acre food plot in, how much tonnage of growth are you getting in that food plot? That's going to depend on how much sunlight it's getting. If it's getting enough water, and you're going to be dependent on rain in order to like irrigate your food plots, especially in the remote areas that we're putting these, it's not going to work unless you can like put a trash pump in like a creek or a pond or something and just dump water on it. You're not going to be able to put enough water with like a Gaylord or something on the back of a UTV, because it needs so much water, and rain is really your only hope there. So you will hear guys all the time just complain about having horrible precipitation and their food plots not really growing that well, and that's just something we all deal with. But after you got that sunlight, you pray for rain, and then the other thing is you need to get that soil tested and get that soil to exactly where you want it to be in order to maximize the tonnage on that food plot. So a lot of you probably have access to like your local feed and seed, your local co-op, whatever. They can do soil tests for you, or they'll at least send them in for you. But the advantage of that is when you get them back, if you've never really done that before, they will sit down and explain it to you. They'll tell you what you need for what you want to plant. You're not just on your own here trying to figure out what your specific soil needs. They'll really help you with that. A lot of these ag groups or whatever, these ag co-ops, they will deliver lime to your property to increase the pH of your soil if they can get their truck to where your plots are. So that could be an advantage to you. Now most of my plots are so remote that I still have to just strap bags to the front and back of the four-wheeler and take them in there and dump them myself. But you have to get that soil quality perfect with fertilizer and lime in order to get the most tonnage of crop out of your food plot. And that's again going to help you in every aspect of putting in food plots, like I said. So, all right, you got your soil right, you got some sunlight down into it. What are we planting in these things? Well, that answer is different for everybody because you need to look around and see what else is planted in your area. So I love to plant soybeans in my food plots, but if I'm hunting or I'm planting a food plot right next to a agricultural soybean field, I'm not going to plant soybeans in my food plot. You need to plant what everybody else isn't. So for example, here in southeastern Wisconsin, my neighbors plant clover food plots, so I don't plant clover food plots. I also hunt right next to an alfalfa egg field, so I really stay away from the clover and chicory and all of that kind of stuff, and I plant brassicas. Nobody in the area plants brassicas. Now, the deer herd doesn't necessarily like those early season, but they love them late season. So I don't only plant brassicas. I also plant, like I said, a bean and pea mix, but I plant forage soybeans and forage peas. So those leaf out a lot more than actually producing like a seed head like you would if you were trying to harvest it, because we're just trying to feed the deer and they eat the leaves, not the pods. So we want those to leaf out and get as thick as possible. So I get those beans and peas out there, I mix them together. The peas just climb up the beans and they actually fill in nicely together, but I also put in cereal grain with that in order to use it as a nurse crop so that the deer don't just nip off those peas and beans as soon as they come out of the ground. So that's what I specifically do. I love diversity in my food plots. So that brassica blend that I put in is several different varieties of brassica, so I get a lot of variety out of just that, and that's planted on half of the plot. Then the other half is planted in, again, a variety, the beans, the peas, and then I plant whatever cereal grain is on sale or cheapest that year. So I think I did oats this year. I've done winter rye in the past. And then if you do all this and your food plot fails, it gets browsed down to nothing. I had part of mine, it flooded earlier in the year when I planted it. You just throw down some winter rye, that stuff will grow anywhere. You can fill in your bald spots or your entire food plot if it fails, and you can always fix a failed food plot with winter rye later in the season. So we always have a backup plan also. But I love that diversity in the food plot. The more different things you have in it, as long as they're not things that compete with each other. So I don't plant anything with those brassicas other than the brassicas themselves, because they take so long to get growing that if you planted like beans or peas with them, the beans and peas would choke them out. No sun would get down to them and they just wouldn't grow. So you definitely want to look at like how fast things grow and how tall they grow before you just start blending everything together. That's why I love putting brassicas on half of the plot and those other plants on the other half of the plot. So the other thing to keep in mind when you do that is when I'm planting half and half, I do them in like strips through the plot. So like I told you guys earlier, I like doing like a boomerang shape plot. I do it like a strip of brassicas and then a strip of the beans and peas so that the entire plot kind of has everything. But then the thing you need to keep in mind is brassicas can't be planted in the same part of your plot more than 2 years in a row. I just rotate every other year. So you do need to kind of note this down somewhere or just remember, take pictures, whatever helps and whatever works for you guys. But you want to make sure that those brassicas are being rotated from one side of the plot to the other, however you're planting, just so your soil stays high quality and continues to grow stuff for you years and years to come. Now, the thing to keep in mind though, this is something that I didn't really know when I started doing this years ago, was you don't actually plant in the spring like you would your vegetable garden or like a farmer would plant an egg field. You're actually planting like later in the season because you want those plants to be young and tender during hunting season. So everything we do is focused on the hunt, right? We're not focused on harvesting these. So we aren't worried about them growing as big and as mature as they can get so that we can harvest them before winter. We're looking for them to be the most attractive to the wildlife come hunting season. And so we're actually looking for them to be a lot earlier in their growth stage come hunting season than they would be if they were in an egg field that time of year. And that's also how you're going to pull those deer out of those egg fields and onto your food plots, because you're going to have a nice younger tender version of whatever is maybe in those egg fields. And so that's going to get the deer on your food plots as well. So when we're planting, we're looking at usually August as a plant date. Now that is gonna vary depending on where you are in the country. So I plant early August on my northwestern Wisconsin property, but I plant middle August in my southeastern Wisconsin food plot. So that is something to keep in mind of your plant date. You're just gonna kind of have to adjust to your area. You can kind of follow that line across the country, you know, northern Wisconsin, and then however far that travels east and west, that's about early August. And then southern part of Wisconsin, that is gonna be your mid to late August, and then just kind of add weeks the further south you go. Now, obviously you're gonna get, if you go too far, you're gonna get right into hunting season, so you're definitely gonna want it planted before that. But usually the further south you go too, you may not be planting something like that. You may be going more, you know, clover and chicory down there or whatever, something that you're going to have established, that you may even be frost seeding even this time of year if there's not too much snow on the ground. But just look at the different varieties, look at what's available in your area, what your neighbors are planting, what's in the egg fields, all that, and plant something different so that you're creating an attraction that's something new, different, and hopefully more attractive than anything else that's in the area. The other thing I should cover here is if you do have multiple food plots, plant the same thing in all of them. Don't have like a clover food plot over here and a bean food plot and a pea food plot and a cereal grain food plot. Don't do that, because it's whatever one of those is popping at that time, the deer are going to nail that. They're going to browse it down to nothing. And then whenever the next one comes up, they're going to nail that. They're going to browse it down to nothing. You want to keep your deer spread out on your property, because if all of your herd is going to the same little food plot, they're going to put too much social pressure on each other. They're going to like push each other off of your property, and you're actually not going to be able to hold as many deer on your property as you could if you planted the same thing in, say, all 4 of your food plots, if you have 4 of them. So you definitely want to spread your herd out on your property. And I know that that could maybe make it more challenging to hunt, because you don't necessarily know which deer is going to which plot on which day, but they do stay pretty consistent. You know, get those cameras out there, see what they're doing, and you can hunt based off of that. Now, if all you have is food plots in, by all means, you can hunt your food plots. They are a great afternoon hunting location, but they can also be useful in the morning as well. we've harvested bucks near our food plots in the morning as they're returning to their bedding areas. They just kind of cruise by the food plots. They're not actually like browsing on them that time of day typically. But this year during gun deer season, we harvested 2 bucks within 20 yards of our food plots. So even though the food plots do start to deteriorate as the snow falls and whatever, they're still coming and checking them out. They're still used to moving through those areas of the woods. You're able to establish that line of movement earlier in the season, and they seem to continue using it even if those food plots aren't as lush and green as they were earlier in the season. So a lot of this is like, you know, just get these food plots in, get them right. Once you get these food plots in, you can start working on everything else. And you know, the other thing is when you're putting in food plots, we need to worry about screening them, because the more they're screened, deer don't like to be able to see out into the woods. They like to feel like they're in a thick area of the woods that's like tight and covering them and not letting anything else see them either. And so when you're deciding where to put your food plots, think of like topography. If you have hills that are cutting down sight lines and stuff that make them feel safe and secure in those food plots, that's going to really work out well for you. But otherwise, you can put in stuff like shrubs or switchgrass or whatever on the edges of your food plots in order to screen them as well. And then of course, think of how you're going to ingress and egress into a stand location that's not going to allow deer that are on that plot to see you either. So those are all things you want to keep in mind while you're doing this. That'll all be covered in future videos. Like I said in previous videos, I'm going to start covering each of these habitat improvements one by one going forward. I'm going to put a video out every week, so make sure you guys stay tuned for that. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss those. And again, leave a comment down below if you think I missed anything in here. But there is a huge advantage to putting in these food plots. They are going to be so advantageous for you guys. They're going to really improve your hunt even if you don't have any of the other habitat improvements on your property. Food plots will be the food source that deer hit up right before dark, before they head off to feed on your neighbor's egg fields or your neighbor's corn pile or whatever else is out there. They definitely love to hit these up right before dark, and that of course is when you're going to have a shot on them during legal hunting hours. There is nothing more attractive and more consistent for deer movement than a food plot. So start with these, and then we'll get into those other things in the other videos, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.